Freedom! It is good to be here. God, we thank you for the privilege of life and the ability to stand for justice. Help us and surprise us, hold us and keep us. Amen. I'm so thankful to the 29th All Peoples celebration for allowing me to come, to my friend Doug Moore, to Andrea and to Christopher, all of the people that you blame for anything I say today. I'm thankful. You know, there was a man that entered his mule in the Kentucky Derby, and somebody asked him, why would you enter a swayback mule in the Kentucky Derby? You know he can't win. I said, and the man said, I know he can't win. The other person said he might not even get out of the gate. He said, that may be true. Well, why would you pay the entry fee? He said, well, I thought being around those thoroughbreds, the exposure might do him some good. So you all brought me all the way from the country, the other side of the world, of the United States, because you all thought the exposure might do me some good, and I hope it will. Hello, San Diego. I wanted to bring my poet today, Maya, back on stage. You know, these are not normal times. And I want to say something. I hope y'all don't get offended. I want to be pastoral. But we can't ask Donald Trump to listen when we don't listen to one of our own. And we didn't listen to this sister. We were very rude. We talked through her whole poem, and we missed a penetrating truth. Now, maybe we didn't do it intentional. We're glad to see each other. We were eating. We didn't hear the announcer say, be quiet, but we can't ask other folk to change if we don't change. This sister is an Arab American who's a Catholic. See, some of you might not even know that. You might automatically think that she's an Arab American who's a Muslim, which would be fine, but she is diversity personified. And as I was listening to her, because I said to a couple of folk I couldn't even talk because I believe in respecting people. She said, transformation is not meant to be calm, cute, and it is never craved. That's enough right there to carry us into this new season of fighting. Would you give Maya a standing ovation for her poetry? Thank you. Thank you, my sister. I'm a preacher, so there is a scripture in the Bible found in the 3rd chapter of the book of Daniel, and I want to read it in the Message Bible. It reads like this: King Nebuchadnezzar built a gold tower 90 feet high and 9 feet thick. He set it up, and then he ordered everybody to come to the tower. He had everybody, his herald, to announce that whenever you hear the band, the trumpets, the drums, fall on your knees and bow down to the golden tower that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. The band began to play. Everybody began to bow down. And then, just then, some Babylonian fortune tellers stepped up and accused the Jews and said, King Nebuchadnezzar, you gave orders. In fact, you tweeted them, wrong century. Wrong century, apologize. You sent them out, and you said that whoever didn't bow would be thrown in the fire. Well, there's some Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they don't respect you and have refused to bow. The king got angry, and he turned purple-faced and had them brought in and says, you don't respect my gods, you refuse to worship at my gold tower. I'm gonna give you a second chance. And when the band strikes, if you don't worship it, I'm gonna throw you in the fire, because who is your God and who can rescue you from my power? And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, your threat doesn't mean anything to us. We don't have to answer you. If you throw us in the fire, the God we serve can rescue us. But even if he doesn't, it won't make a bit of difference, because we're still not going to worship your gods or bow down to your statue. I want you to turn to a person beside you and say, bowing down. Now say it like you mean it. Say, bowing down, standing down is not an option. It was April the 4th, 1967, almost 50 years ago, that Dr. King continued his love justice movement, refusing to bow down to the pressures of the American power structure that had within it racism, classism, and militarism. 67. The campaign of George Wallace was beginning as George Wallace was planning to take his Southern segregation yesterday, today, and tomorrow strategy national. Campaign of Richard Nixon was being planned that would be designed to exploit the populations and the community's anxieties over the civil rights movement, racial and class fear. Nixon would use racially coded words like crime and unrest and entitlement reform to signal to white voters that he offered a respectable alternative to Wallace. King saw it. Dr. King had been pushing for a Marshall Plan, a $50 billion federal program to address poverty And once when he was in jail, he got in a conversation with the jailers who were trying to argue to him that segregation was right. And one day he asked them, "How much do you make?" And when they told him how much they made to keep him in jail, he said, "You ought to be marching with us, because you just as poor as Negroes." Dr. King knew that you could never in America address the issues of our democracy and help America mend every flaw without dealing with race and class together. Dr. King was jailed 14 times, stabbed once in the chest by a black woman, beaten at least twice in public. His home was bombed. He received constant death threats. When he died, he was 39 years old, but his heart, they said, looked like it was over 60. The FBI tried to get him to commit suicide by threatening to send his wife audio tapes of what they claimed were extramarital affairs. Of course, you know it was the cross-dresser named J. Edgar Hoover that came up with that scheme. I'm not against cross-dressers, I just don't like J. Edgar Hoover. Yet, Dr. King never abandoned his activism. He often worked 20-hour days. He gave up to 450 speeches in one year. He talked about having a tough mind and a tender heart. The movement was always in trouble. It was always between disappointment and satisfaction. There were always things that could demoralize. Consider, I was reading Brother Coates's writing the other day. John Blake's writing at CNN, he interviewed me. Consider what happened after the I Have a Dream speech. A lot of people want to limit Dr. King to the last 4 minutes of the I Have a Dream speech, but consider, for instance, what happened after the I Have a Dream speech. I was born 2 days after that speech because my mother said she went into labor on the 28th, but I said, hold up, let's see what this march does, Mom. Let's see. But right after the dream speech and his dealing with the nightmare of America, the Civil Rights Bill couldn't get a full vote. 4 black girls were blown up in a church in reaction to the victory in Birmingham, because the Birmingham victory had come in the spring. They were blown up in reaction to his speech, to the March on Washington, to the victory. John F. Kennedy, who had given a courageous speech in June, was assassinated, and all of the momentum of the movement seemed lost. And then in 1967, with all of this baggage and all of the jailings, Dr. King stands up to challenge America's war in Vietnam and to challenge racism, materialism, and militarism. He stood up as a gospel preacher who knew you can't love Jesus without loving justice, and you can't love Jesus without speaking out and standing up against wrong. And so, I want y'all to hear this because I'm a little troubled by people who want to just fall out over one election. Movements don't work like that. Dr. King dared to take on the whole country. He took on a Democratic president. He said that America was the greatest purveyor of violence. April 4th, 1967. The next morning, 150 newspapers wrote articles against him. Some of us can't stand one tweet. 150 newspapers, some of them black newspapers. Unions wrote resolutions against him. Can I tell the whole truth? The NAACP came out with a resolution against him. Some of the members of the SCLC were against him. Many preachers left him when he dared to call for a moral revolution of values around racism and classism and militarism. And 6 months after that, his poll numbers had dropped. They had pulled his open invitation to the White House. President Johnson had loosed the FBI. How dare him challenge me? 6 months later, with everything looking like it's going the wrong way, Dr. King says it's time now to have a poor people's campaign. And he preached the text that I read at Ebenezer Church. His sermon was, "But if not." And he declared that sometimes you have to stand for what's right, and it doesn't matter if you get quick deliverance. Even if God doesn't deliver, there comes a time when bowing down and standing down is not an option. Six months later, he would be murdered, but he was murdered standing up. And here we are today, and we are seeing again this year a theme that too often recurs in the American story. That is that America tends to take a few steps forward, and then there is a reclamation. There is always a call to take things back. That was the call in the 1870s after the end of the Civil War and the Reconstruction movement. A movement rose up called the Redemption Movement, and the theme of that movement was we got to take things back and make America great again. That was the call of the Richard Nixon campaign and the George Wallace campaign. Here we are in the 21st century, my friends, and we still find that racism and economic fear can still too often conjure a powerful magic which will compel many of this nation to seek safety in hating the other and security in the false nativism that has failed us before and will fail us again. Long before the Russian hack, and they did hack, but long before the Russian hacked, the American electoral process was already hacked and compromised by racism and fear. Long before Donald Trump, the Southern strategy that was developed by Kevin Phillips has been used for the last 50 years to divide and conquer. And these tactics touch something deep in our DNA, a fundamental fear that is played upon that grows out of what Jim Wallace calls America's original sin of racism. And that fundamental fear is ever seeking to come forth and masquerade itself as normal. You know, one of the most underreported stories of 2016 is that America experienced its first federal election in a half century without the full protection of the Voting Rights Act. Last year, while some were going across the Edmunds-Pettus Bridge to commemorate what they did, the forces of regression were taking the Voting Rights Act back across the back across the Edmunds-Pettus Bridge, undoing what they did. And you think about it, we had 25 presidential primary and general election debates, Republican and Democrat. and not a single question about the attacks on voting rights. Not a single question to any candidate running in the primary or in the general election on where they stood on the Voting Rights Act. Even though we've had more than 20-some states rewrite laws and voter suppression laws, 14 had new voting restrictions in place for the first time in 2016. Laws that the courts are now saying were intentional surgical racism, as the case in North Carolina. On Election Day, there were 868 fewer voting places in the states with a long history of voter discrimination, like Arizona, Texas, Georgia, Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina. And these changes impacted hundreds of thousands of voters. In North Carolina, we won, beat them, but even in beating them, the courts did not order the specific number of voting places they had to have, and so the extremists in the Republican Party did the minimum, which means we had 158 less voting sites in 2016 than we had in 2012. And the black turnout decreased by 16% in the first week of early voting. That's more than 60-some thousand votes in just one area, Greensboro, in the 40 heavily black counties. So this election is more about what happened in Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania. It is about the systemic attack on the right to vote 50 years after the Voting Rights Act. It is literally about that. It is how, if you think about it, if you can control the 13 former Confederate states, if you can lock up what's called the Solid South. California, y'all need to hear this because we need some of y'all to come back south and help us fight. I'm gonna talk about that. We're gonna be doing some things, and we're gonna need you like they came to Selma 50 years ago to come home, come south, and some lawyers in this room. We need you to sign you up to come south and give some pro bono help. Because see, what you need to understand is the mathematics that the extremists like Trump and Ryan and McConnell work with, and this is how it works on the presidential level. They know that if they control the 13 former Confederate states from North Virginia to Texas, they control 171 electoral votes, which means they only need 99 from the other 37 states. They control 31% of the United States House of Representatives, which means they only need 20% from the other 37 states. They control 26 members of the United States Senate, which means they only need 25 from the other 37 states. So they know if they can lock up the South and create a situation where blacks and whites and Latinos are separated from one another, then they start out with 171 electoral votes to the good. I used to hustle pool, and I would take that bet. But they also know that we are at a time now where if you registered 30% of the unregistered voters in those same southern states, and you could get black and Latinos to come together and work together, you could change the Solid South, and if you change the South, you change the nation. We got to be clear. You cannot understand 2016 without turning back the pages of campaign history. You got to go back to the redemption movement in the 1870s, when another president lost the popular vote, but was selected through the Electoral College with a promise, a compromise, Rutherford B. Hayes. He was selected as long as he promised to roll back the gains, to change the Supreme Court, which is why in 1875, America passed the Civil Rights Act. But by 1883, 7 years after the election of Rutherford B. Hayes with new Supreme Court justices, the Supreme Court overturned the Civil Rights Act of 1875. That's why Dr. King opened his speech at the mall with these words, 100 years later. He was being sarcastic to a certain degree. He was saying, America, we did this 100 years ago, and here we are right back doing the same thing again. You can't understand this election without understanding Barry Goldwater in '64 or George Wallace in '68. If you Google George Wallace's 1968 speech in Madison Square Garden and play a tape of Donald Trump's stump speech, it's almost the same speech. Right on down to get them out of here with their long hairs, those hippies. Somebody ought to knock them out. It's all in that speech. You can't understand this campaign without understanding Ronald Reagan's campaign and how he began it in Philadelphia, Mississippi, at the fairgrounds right down from where Swanner, Cheney, and Goodman were killed, and how in that speech he used the Southern strategist thesaurus, where you talk about race but you don't sound like a racist. You talk about tax cuts and entitlement reform and law and order, which are all dog whistles and code words for race. My sisters and brothers, let us be clear. There's nothing unprecedented about Donald Trump's election. If you know American history, his appeal to the lesser angels of our nature is as American as apple pie. Newsflash, this is not America's first time electing a racist president. This is not the first time a white man has used racial fear and economic fear and mixed them into a poisonous brew. It's not the first time. The only thing that should surprise us about this is not that it's an anomaly, it's not, but the ease at which Trump and Ryan and McConnell could use this strategy in the 21st century, and the ease at which the media was caught up in it, and the Democrats didn't know how to talk about it, and the Republicans knew how to be quiet and let it work. And let us be clear, this is not just about a president. It's about an entire web of money and influence that's been working to tie up the American democracy, even as the divide between the rich and the poor is its widest in the nation's history, and our electorate is growing more diverse every year. Wealthy, greedy oligarchs know they cannot hold on to power in truly democratic elections. So we are witnessing an all-out assault, foreign and domestic, on the very heart of our democracy. And it's not simply about the preservation of a government conceived by human beings. This really is about the fundamental well-being of the creation and the survival of those creatures who bear God's image. At the very moment we live in, when millions desperately need a government and a society with a heart, millions of Americans need health care and living wages and protection from xenophobia and systemic racism and homophobia and religious bigotry and immigration resentment and climate destruction. Right at the very time that we need these things to most, too many are crying, too many are dying. And this moment that we're in is about whether a government of the people and by the people will in fact serve the people. It's about whether we as the people can reconstruct the heart of our democracy and keep moving this nation a little bit more towards being perfect. This is no ordinary moment. This is no ordinary moment, and yet it is as American as apple pie. And so in this moment, we don't so much need to be Democrats and Republicans. We don't need to be left and right. I don't even know what that means. I got two hands, left and right. And I'm certainly not going to call somebody right that I think is wrong. The first thing we have to do is loose ourselves from the language of the empire. I mean, I'm a conservative. See, I knew y'all wasn't going to clap at that. See how you've been fooled? See how you've been fooled? You, watch this, you are too. See, you won't even say amen to that. Watch this. Let me show you what I'm talking about. See how we've been hoodwinked. What is the first principle of the American Constitution? Those four things. The establishment of what? Justice, right? Now, how many of you want to conserve justice? Conserve means to hold on to, right? Now, how many of you want to liberally spread justice? So you're a conservative and you're a liberal. You see my point? My point is we need a movement that changes even the language, which is why in the moral movement we're saying we need a moral movement. That's what Dr. King never, go read all his speeches. He never talked about Democrat and Republican. He talked about the higher moral law. He talked about America, what did you say on paper? He looked at issues, and we talk about it like this. He said, is this issue constitutionally consistent? Is it morally defensible? And is it economically just? America needs a moral revolution of values. And I think I can name 5 areas that I think we ought to agree on, we can work together on. Protecting and expanding voting rights and ending voter suppression and unconstitutional gerrymandering. Never giving up on equal protection under the law, protecting women's rights, immigrant rights, LGBTQ rights, labor rights, religious freedom rights. Can we agree on that? That's a moral agenda. Can we agree that a moral agenda is pro-labor, anti-poverty, anti-racist policies that build up an economic democracy through full employment, living wages, the alleviation of disparate unemployment, a just transition from fossil fuels, labor rights, affordable housing, social safety nets for the poor, fair policies for immigrants, and critiquing policies around warmongering that undermine our moral standing at home and abroad? Can we agree? This is not a Clinton agenda or a Bernie agenda or a Democratic agenda, a moral agenda. Equality in education by ensuring that every child receives a high-quality, well-funded, constitutional, diverse public education, and that we protect teachers, and that we have access to community college and universities. A moral agenda. A moral agenda would be an agenda that says we want health care for all. We might start with the Affordable Care Act, but we want universal health care for everybody, Medicaid and Medicare and Social Security. And we want environmental protection and climate protection, and we want to protect women's rights to women's health. Isn't that a moral agenda? Help me on this mic some. And then finally, fairness in the criminal justice system by addressing the continuing inequalities in the system for black, brown, and poor white people. And we must fight the proliferation of guns and unhook the unholy hold that the NRA has on our political system. Isn't that that's a moral agenda. And that's why over 10,000 clergy and activists joined myself and Sister Simone Campbell and Tracy Blackman and Jim Forbes as we did a moral revival across this nation. And we wrote Donald Trump and we said we would meet with him, but in a house of worship. We can't bow in the tower now. And we said to him in that letter, we do not believe that these are left or right issues. These are right or wrong issues. And while we know no human being is perfect, we wish to speak to you about these moral issues because far too much is at stake for you to succumb to your worst demons while in office. But as of today, he hadn't chosen to respond. We know he got the letter because we sent it certified. Instead, he has chosen to meet with those who represent the theological malpractice and heresy of so-called white evangelicalism. That despite that despite the more than 2,000 scriptures in just the Hebrew and Christian Bible that says the major moral issues are how you treat the poor, how you treat the least of these, how you treat women, how you treat the immigrant, and despite the constitutional call to establish justice and promote the general welfare, you do know welfare is not a bad word, to promote the general welfare, so-called white evangelicalism says the only moral issues are prayer in the school, standing against homosexuality, against women's health, and for property rights and the right to own guns. And the problem, the reason I call it heresy, because I am an evangelical. I'm a theologically evangelical, conservative, liberal, biblicist, charismatic, Pentecostal, stand for justice Christian. In other words, I know Jesus for myself. That's what that means. And the reason we challenge so-called white evangelicalism, again, as Jim Wallace says, white evangelicalism, the emphasis is on the word white, and it's on people who want to misuse evangelicalism. Jesus said in his first sermon, the Spirit of the Lord upon me to preach good news, evangelical, to the poor. And the word poor there is patokos in Greek. It means those who have been made poor by systems of exploitation. So if you claim to be a person of faith and you're not talking about dealing with systems of poverty and economic exploitation and not individual charity where you take somebody the turkey every Thanksgiving and say you've done your duty. But if you don't challenge the systems of inequality, you're not faithful, you're a fraud. That's what you're doing. You're not faithful. And Mr. Trump has chosen to meet with them and to meet with comedians and boxing promoters and actors, evidently, not that I'm mad per se, but evidently because he can't handle a real moral debate and a real moral discussion. In fact, we ought to take Representative John Lewis's argument a bit further about this illegitimate piece. Even before Donald Trump tweeted insults and a lie about Representative John Lewis's district and his lifetime of service, he had already insulted the legacy of John Lewis and so many other black, white, brown justice activists. And not just Mr. Trump, even many who didn't tweet what Trump tweeted, but they have supported his political regressivism, they insult the legacy of John Lewis. Because just getting up saying, like Mr. Pence did yesterday, John Lewis is such a great icon, and I can't believe he would use his stature to criticize the president. Unto whom much is given, much is required. That's what you use stature for. If God gives you stature, then you use that stature to speak the truth. And, you know, I tested the word. He said it was not illegitimate. Well, the word illegitimate means not authorized by law, not in accordance with accepted standards or rules. So when Mr. Trump is pushing an agenda to repeal health care and to build walls and to stoke racism and xenophobia, he is illegitimate because his actions are a violation of our deepest moral values and our deepest constitutional values. What he is doing is not authorized by moral law. And I would urge him, and we ought to urge him to repent and choose the legitimate path of love, justice, and equal protection for all. It's illegitimate. And so here we are. Here we are. Representative Lewis spoke the truth. And he didn't speak a racial truth. He spoke the truth that's been forged in the battles to free this country of what Dr. King called the triune evils of racism, classism, and materialism. And the only way out for Trump and those with him, the only way they can be legitimate in the eyes of the moral law, in the eyes of the deepest values of our Constitution, is to repent and turn from their ways. And for him to suggest that John Lewis hadn't done anything makes me and other folk want to say, well, it makes me want to say something I can't say as a preacher. So I had to find another way to say it. Because when I hear Kelly Conway, Lord help that child. Help that child. And Omarosa, Lord help that child. You're going to have to bow down to Donald. Lord help. It makes me want to say what Stevie Wonder said. We are amazed but not amused by all the things you say that you'll do, though much concerned but not involved with the decisions that you have made by you. We are sick and tired of hearing your song telling how you're going to change from right to wrong, because if you really want to know our views, you haven't done nothing. You ain't done. So we must build a movement that declares standing down and bowing down is not an option. We must bring poor people together, black and white and Latino and Christian and Muslim and Jewish and people of faith and people not of faith but who trust in a moral universe, and gay and straight and civil rights and labor. We must build not a populist movement, because down south, see, we're scared of populist movement, because populist movement used to be lynch mobs. We need a moral fusion movement, a moral fusion movement, because that's the kind of movement that has always turned the nation forward. There was a moral underpinning under the abolition movement. There was a moral underpinning under the women's suffrage movement. There was a moral underpinning under the social gospel. There was a moral underpinning under the New Deal. There was a moral underpinning under the civil rights movement. And that is why people have worked so hard to hijack a moral movement. And so we have to have a resolve now. Like William Lloyd Garrison, we got to declare he was an abolitionist. He said, I will be heard. Like Frederick Douglass, we have to be clear where justice is denied and where poverty is enforced, where ignorance prevails, and where any one class is made to feel that society is an organized conspiracy to oppress, to rob, and to degrade them. Neither persons nor property will be safe. We cannot stand down. Like Ella Baker, the great freedom fighter, we must say, in order for us as poor and oppressed people to become a part of a society that is meaningful, the system under which we now exist has to be radically changed. We cannot stand down. Like Fannie Lou Hamer, when they said, Miss Hamer, what if they kill you? She said, well, if they kill me, I'm going to fall 5 foot 4 inches forward, but I'm not going backwards. We can't stand down. Like the poet Jane Cortez up in Oakland, and she said, let us steel ourselves and say, if we don't fight, if we don't resist, if we don't organize and unify and get the power to control our lives, then we will wear the exaggerated look of submission, the bizarre look of suicide, the dehumanized look of fear, and the decomposed look of repression forever and forever. Standing down is not an option. Like Dr. King, we must confess that there comes a time when silence is betrayal, and that we must have an eternal dissatisfaction with poverty, racism, materialism, and militarism. There comes a time, like Jesus, we have to say, whoa, stop, unto those who engage in a whole lot of religious practices but leave undone the weightier matters of love, justice, mercy, and faith. Like Isaiah 10, we have to say, woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights. Like Paul in the book of Hebrews, in the face of opposition, we must declare the just shall live by faith. We are not of those who shrink back unto destruction, but we are those who persevere unto the salvation of the soul. And so, let me go back to the text for a minute and remind you that there was a time when 3 millennial boys, maybe one was in the Black Lives Matter movement of his day, and the other was in the Moral Monday movement, and the other was in the union movement and the fight for 15. All I know is their names were Shadrach, Meshach, and a bad Negro. Have mercy, Jesus. And they faced this fella, and he was a narcissist who believed his own reports and believed his own press. And he had himself an inauguration. And he was a mighty king. And when he ruled, he issued orders, he meant business. He had a golden tower made in his image, put his name on it, told everybody to come bow down to the tower with his name on it. Y'all know the story. He called all the judges, all the governors and the legislators in, and they had this inauguration service for the golden image. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they represent the choice that's faced in every age by those who must either support an oppressive regime or face certain death. They represent those who hear and follow the call of another voice. And you see, it was the goal of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians to challenge their cultural identification. Nebuchadnezzar wanted them to forget their identity, to forget their heritage, forget their legacy, forget their journey, and just stand down and bow down. He wanted them to feel a sense of being something other than. He wanted their status to be inverted. He wanted everybody to feel less than him when they were around him because he was insecure in his own self. That's what we see Nebuchadnezzar. And the king's name literally means one who will protect his crown and power at all costs. It means somebody that will do anything to hold on to power. That's why Nebuchadnezzar built his tower. Over 10 stories tall, put his name on it. Everything he built, he put his name on it because he was a narcissistic maniac. Lord have mercy. And whenever, I don't know why y'all act like y'all know this contemporarily. Whenever his music played, he wanted people to bow at the tower, pledge allegiance to him. And Nebuchadnezzar stood before the people and said, I and I alone can do this. He didn't believe in God. He didn't ask for God's help. He didn't ask for God's forgiveness. Whatever he wanted to do, he thought he could do. Whatever he wanted to do to other nations, he thought he could do. Whatever he wanted to do to women, grab them wherever, he thought he could do. Whatever he wanted to do to his opponents, he thought he could do it. He felt like it was all right because all that mattered was protecting his ego and protecting his power. That's Nebuchadnezzar I'm talking about. He said, if you want a job, come to my tower and bow down. If you want favor, come to my tower. If you want protection, come to my tower. If you want money, come to my tower. And this was not merely an act of respect toward the king, but an act of worship. But these 3 young Hebrew boys, these millennials, found that this was something they could not do. The false prophets might do it. Those who wanted a job in his kingdom might do it. Even those that didn't support him might do it. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow at the tower. They could not accept the religion of the king, the religion of greed, the religion of hate. They could not make that superior to their own. They could not go through the motions of bowing to a statue while believing and holding on to their own belief. They knew that this was no time to bow, that instead it was a time to become living witnesses to what they believed in. So they decided not to bow. And this, my friends, is a political text. That's why Martin Luther King preached it, because the truth is the whole Bible is a political text. The whole Bible is the politics of God, truth and love. You can't bow down. Dr. King preached it. It's a text about the struggle between the oppressed and the oppressor. And I lifted it here today because on January 21st, we're moving from a man of grace and humility. Didn't always agree with him, but he tried. Even though some called him everything but a child of God, he tried to help the poor, tried to help the sick, tried to help others. And we're moving from that person, a cool, constitutional, compassionate lawyer, to a cantankerous, cocky con artist who bullies others to hide his own securities. We're moving to a person who, as Neil Painter has said, people voted for him to be the antidote for their racist hatred of Obama. They voted against their own self-interest just to have a white, lying, strong man than an educated, caring black man followed by a woman who might hold on to the legacy. Because America has not had a grown-up conversation about race and class. Even in the 21st century, we still have not had a grown-up dealing with the issue of race. Racism ain't so much about David Dukes and whether you call somebody the N-word. Systemic racism is rooted in these kind of questions. If there are 8 million more poor white people than there are poor blacks, and 5 million more poor white people than there are Latino, why are 10 of the 12 poorest states governed by so-called red politicians who vote against the programs that would help them? What trumps common sense? What made 2/3 of the voters vote for Trump, and now those 2/3 are going to be the first one that will lose their health care? America has not fully faced this question of race and class. Obama could have helped us, but when he even mentioned race, when you remember when his Professor Finn was arrested, well, he was chastised and made to sit down. He was commander-in-chief, but he was made to sit down with a beer with a street cop. Now, I understand why he chose beer rather than tea, because some stuff make you drink. When you're the commander-in-chief, and you know more about race than anybody else that's ever held the Oval Office, and yet you can't talk about it. We have not yet faced this question. The Republicans deny race, and too often Democrats don't know how to talk about it. Trump used that 50-year-old Southern strategy and turned blacks and whites and Latinos against each other, and at the time they ought to be allies. But the text says that bowing down is not an option. When a person is elected president to lead our country 100 years later, after Woodrow Wilson played Birth of a Nation that glorified the Klan in the White House, and now 100 years after Woodrow Wilson, we got alt-wrong and Steve Bannon and white supremacy back in the White House. Standing down and bowing down is not an option. After the last 8 years, when we have seen Rush Limbaugh dub him Barack the Magic Negro, and Roger Stone, who would go on to advise the Trump campaign, claimed that Michelle Obama could be heard on tape yelling "Whitey," you ought to read Taisha Coates' piece on this. And when you've seen over and over again a Republican women's club in California dispensed Obama bucks featuring slices of watermelon, ribs, and fried chicken. A Missouri congressperson equated Obama with a monkey. A California GOP official took up the image depicting Obama as a chimp. Sarah Palin assessed the president's foreign policy as shuck and jive. Newt Gingrich dubbed him the food stamp president. When a man like that and has been through all of that, a congressman from South Carolina stands up on the floor and calls him a lie. And now y'all want us to be quiet and not say anything? Standing down and bowing down is not an option. Oh no. When a man, not a god, but just a man, comes into power, and you have a black woman named Susan Rice, who has a PhD as a Rhodes Scholar, who served as a Brookings Institute Fellow on International Affairs, serving as UN Ambassador and then National Security, and now just a man wants to replace her with a woman governor of South Carolina who kept up the Confederate flag, only removed it after 9 people were killed at Mother Emanuel, which sent a message to the nation that only black death matters, and you think we're going to be quiet? Standing down is not an option. When a man says, you just bow down to my power, because I'm going to use my power to take money from public schools that are already underfunded. I'm going to give it to private schools that can deny students access. Bowing down and standing down is not an option. When a man and a Congress, people who get free health care just because they get elected, but now once they're elected, they don't want the people that elected them to have the same health care that they have. And you're going to repeal a moderate form of health care, take 20 million Americans' health care, 17 million white, 3 million black, Take coverage from women who need screening, cervical and breast cancer. Take coverage from children and adults. Take coverage from my baby who has a pre-existing brain condition, but she just graduated summa cum laude with 2 degrees from North Carolina Central University. But she walks around every day with a pre-existing condition, and you're going to leave folk to suffer while you in your tower with your doctors. I declare unto you, standing down is not an option. When a man says he believes that the minimum wage is already too high, when there are 250,000 people dying every year from poverty, more than die from heart attacks, strokes, and cancers. 400 families make $96,000 an hour while we are locking people up for simply fighting for $15 an hour. When fast food workers work 40 and 50 hours and still have to get welfare and public assistance because the corporate crooks take all the money and will not give them what they need. When in Denmark, McDonald's workers over the age of 18 earn $20 an hour, and the Big Mac is just 30 cents higher than it is here in America. And when we know that the minimum wage would be $20 an hour in America if it had kept rate with inflation, and we've got a billionaire that wants us to have pity on billionaires and not fight to uplift workers, I declare unto you, bowing down and standing down is not an option. Oh no. I'll get it. Turn this mic up some. I know she told me to wrap up, but this ain't no time for bumper sticker preaching. We're in a transformative moment. When 6 of the 10 wealthiest Americans inherit their wealth, it's not earned, but then they stand up and say how successful they are, as though the rest of us are not working like hell to get what we got. Standing down is not an option. When you can buy lead-free gas, but you can't be guaranteed lead-free water, bowing down. When voter suppression is at an all-time high, and we want to put Jeff Sessions as the Attorney General, who has a contempt for the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, who applauded voter suppression. That's like putting the fox over the chicken house. Standing down is not an option. And so I came by to tell you, whatever rejection you felt on November the 8th, it's time to shake yourself. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't bow down to Nebuchadnezzar 2,600 years ago, and you can't bow down to the spirit of Nebuchadnezzar in the 21st century. We better know who we are. We are the children of Martin, the children of Dorothy Day, the children of Rabbi Heschel, the children of Muhammad and Moses, Abraham and Sarah, Jesus and Mary, Harriet and Sojourner and Rosa and Fannie Lou. Standing down is not an option. We don't bow down to meanness. We don't stand down to wrong. We stand up. Stand up for the poor. Stand up for the sick. Stand up for the least of these. Stand up for the brokenhearted. This is no time to bow. They said, Nebuchadnezzar, we can't bow. Our God is able to deliver, but if not, we're not bound. Some people have a though if faith. Lord, if you make it easy, if everything is all right. But we need a though faith. Though it's not easy. though we might have to march. Well, a group of ministers, we're getting ready to plan the National Moral Revival Poor People's Poor Children campaign. Not to honor what Dr. King did in 2018. We don't need another commemoration. We need a consecration. We need a reimagination. We need to march on every state capital and all throughout this country and D.C. with poor people, black and white and Latino, holding hands together saying, we will not bow down. Oh, Lord. Can I finish now? Nebuchadnezzar told those boys that if they didn't bow down, he'd throw them into fire. But what he didn't know is that those boys already had a fire. They had a fire down on the inside. They refused to eat the king's meat or drink the king's wine at Babylon. They, rather than get drunk on the wine of the world and the wine of Egypt, they remembered the stories of deliverance from Egypt. They didn't believe the tweets and the press that the king was putting out. They sang the songs of Zion. They declared, ain't gonna let nobody turn us around. And the king and his men didn't know it, that Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego were a part of God's moral movement. They didn't bow down. They didn't bow down, and they said, we're not going to bow down even if things aren't changed right now. My sisters and brothers, I know what can happen when you don't bow down. 3 years ago in North Carolina, they told us it was over. They said we have the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. They called us Moron Moral Monday. We went there. They voted worse when we first started going. We first got arrested. They arrested people in wheelchairs. Then they arrested over 1,000 of us. But we went into fire together. We marched together. We built a strategy together. We went to jail together. We registered voters together. We sued them in court together. And just a few weeks ago in November, we won back the governorship, the attorney general, the auditor, the secretary of state. And for the first time, we put 2 African Americans on the Supreme Court, and an African American man won by 350,000 votes in a southern state. If you stand up, don't you understand? They don't want us to stand up because they know how much power we have if we stand up. Hear me today. When you have to cheat and lie and hack and spend lewd amount of money to win an election, it's a sign that you're afraid. In South Africa, they used to say, only a dying mule kicks the hardest. So my brothers and sisters, I'm going to catch a plane back to North Carolina. I hope some of you all will come south. We may be headed into some fiery times, but if we got to go into fire, go in standing up, because turning back is not an option. Falling down is not an option. Looking down is not an option. Standing down is not an option. We cannot bow until justice comes. Now, we cannot bow until we stand before the Lord. We cannot bow until the lion lays down with the lamb. Now, one day I'm going to bow. When the rough places are made smooth, I'll bow then. When the crooked places are made straight, I'll bow then. When the hills are made low, I'll bow then. When the valleys are lifted up, I'll bow then. But until then, bowing is not an option. What do you do when you've done all you can and it seems like it's never enough? What do you do when you feel all alone and you're giving all you can? You just stand, 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 and watch God see us through. Oh, Lord. Grab somebody by the hand. Grab somebody by the hand. I need 20 preachers to run up here to this stage. Muslim, Christian, come on up here. You just stand. Come on, preachers, quick, quick, quick. Find your way around the side. Go through the curtains. Play it loud down. Grab somebody by the hand. Tell that person, say, I'm holding your hand because I can't let you fall. Not now. Tell them, not now. Not with Nebuchadnezzar, not now. Not with the fire, not now. Not when so much is at stake, not now. Standing. Standing down. Falling down is not an option. It's not an option. Is there a Muslim here? Is there a Jewish brother here or sister? I want you to repeat it after me 5 times. Standing down is not an option. Mr. Trump, standing down is not an option. Congressman, standing down is not an option. Tea Party, standing down is not an option. Martin, we hear you. Martin, we hear you. Rosa, we hear you. Dorothy Day, we hear you. Standing down is not an option.